I welcome everyone, and it's with great pleasure that for the month of August, I'm able to introduce Cindy Lawrence, who is the CEO of the Museum of Mathematics in New York. Cindy is a lifelong math enthusiast who started her career in the communication of science field as now, but she will be able to relate the story much better than I have. I was very impressed by the small bio she sent me, but I'm fudging this introduction, so I will just leave this and pass over to Cindy and to talk about playing with mass, squares, and cubes.
Thank you so much, Tiago, and it's so nice to be here. And Tiago's alluding to the fact that I am not a museum director by original plan or design or training. I definitely fell into this job as a labor of love. I started with MoMath as a volunteer. Prior to that, I was involved in education in a different realm. And the only thing I was doing related to mathematics is I was running a program for gifted math students in collaboration with Brookhaven National Laboratory on Long Island, where I live, and I'm still running that program today. So I was a volunteer for a fledgling organization that wasn't even an organization. It was an idea that Glenn Whitney had to open a museum of math. And I thought it sounded like a fabulous idea. And so I thought I would start out by just giving you a little bit of the backstory, not so much about me, but about the museum. So Glenn had an idea for a museum of mathematics. And while I thought it was a great idea, I was certainly in the minority. And so here are some of the things that people said when they heard about our plan to open a museum of mathematics. It's a poor business idea. That came from someone who is today one of our largest donors and supporters, but at the time said, math is great, but no one's going to come. So I wouldn't put any money into this project because it's a really poor business plan. Everyone hates math. We got that a lot. Nobody will come because after all, if everybody hates math, who's going to come? It's destined to fail. That was written in print. And one headline, which I have to admire because I love wordplay, even though I didn't like at all what it said, is Museum of Math, ? It just doesn't add up. And so it was a clever play on words, but I didn't love the sentiment. And actually, I didn't love it so much that I got in touch with the author of that article and I challenged her to come meet with me and let me show her some of the things we had planned to see if she still thought it didn't add up. And the end of that story is that she wrote a follow-up article in which she said, if anyone can do it, these people can, and I'm going to be the first one online when they open. So that was very lovely. But what is math? And if you're looking at your screen now, what you see is the answer to that question the way most people see it. They think about pi. People like pi, a long series of numbers that never end and never repeat. Or they think about school days, pencil and paper, and writing out problems and trying to solve them, or just groups of numbers, or even a mathematician. And there's a picture of a mathematician with lots of things on the board that seem undecipherable. And it's not a surprise that that appears to be a white male because people do think about mathematicians that way as well. And so we're trying to change all of that at MoMath. And this is how we want people to see math. And these are actually 3 images from 3 talks that we've had. The one on the left is an origami sculpture by Eric Demain, who many of you probably know. He's been very involved with the Celebration of Mind and the Gathering for Gardner. In the middle is a very lovely projection that Henry Siegerman came up with. And he's done many wonderful things, as I'm sure, again, many of you are familiar with him. And I think on the right is something from a poster that may have been a Math Encounters presentation. I think it was Carlos Sacan's presentation. And he is a mathematical sculptor and computer scientist. So we want people to see things that look engaging and interesting. And really, if you look at these pictures, somewhat beautiful. So eventually we were able to open a physical space. This is a little bit photoshopped, so the scale is not right, but we really do sit nestled in between the Empire State Building and the Flatiron Building on 26th Street in New York City. And we are reopened, so if anybody finds themselves in New York, I do hope you'll come say hi. But now I like to ask people, what words would you use to describe math? And this audience is probably a great audience to ask that question, because I think you're going to agree with me when I show you the words that we use. But the words that most people use are not the words that we use. Most people, if you ask them to describe math, they'll say things like hard, boring, useless. And what we want people to say is that math can be fun. And I thought it would be nice to give you sort of a pictorial tour of the museum with some pictures that demonstrate some of the words that we hope people will begin to associate with mathematics when they come to MoMath. And as you can see in this picture, all four of these people certainly appear to be having fun. Colorful. People think about math as being very black and white. It's either right or it's wrong. It's pen on paper. And MoMath math is the opposite of black and white. It's actually very colorful and very vibrant. And that's by design. We have a great designer, Tim Nissen, who many of you also know, who really helped us figure out how to make captivating exhibits so that when people come in, if they're afraid of math, if they don't have a great relationship with math, they don't come in and say, oh yeah, this is math, I should turn around and leave. Instead, they see something that's very colorful and very engaging. Math can also be very creative. I know most of you on this call know that, but many people don't. Many people think about math the way it was in their early school days. You're given a problem and there's an answer, and there's a way to get to the answer. And even if you think of another way to get to the answer, sometimes that's not even allowed or encouraged. You're just meant to follow a set algorithm, a set path of rules, and get an answer. But at MoMath, we have lots of opportunities for people to be creative and play with math, whether it's building with Zoom Tool on the left, or building with another geometry toy called It's Fun in the middle, or on the right, actually painting with one of the 17 wallpaper groups, which is an eternally popular exhibit. We also think math should be exploratory. We want people to be thinking and playing and discovering on their own. So we don't just want to have text on a wall that tells you something, but we want you to play and discover something. And you see that all three folks here, or four folks in the pictures, seem to be very engaged with what they're playing with. Math can also be full body, and we don't think of it that way necessarily. We think about math as something that is very cerebral. You sit down, you're thinking, you're discovering, you're writing. But we tried to incorporate some experiences where you're riding on something or running or moving your arms. And we think that's another way to engage with people, because after all, people get excited about different things in different ways. And math really does connect to every discipline in the world around us. So full body is important. And if you come to next month's presentation, you'll get a really great example of that with Carl Schaefer. Collaborative. Sometimes people think about math as something that you go and do by yourself, very quietly or very competitively with others. But we try to make a lot of opportunities where people can work together, whether it's solving a puzzle together, as you see the four people doing in the top left, or building a giant, in this case, folded paper construction. That's Eric Demain in our first Math Encounters presentation way back in, I think, 2010. And everybody made little pieces of that. And then by the end of the night, they were all put together into a giant sculpture. Or even down at the bottom, just some magnets that tessellate or fill space, and kids working together to see what they can create. Many of you are familiar with the square wheel tricycle exhibit. That's the most popular exhibit by the one that people have heard of the most. And I like to say that this exhibit demonstrates that math can make the impossible possible. An interesting backstory about the square wheel tricycle, a couple backstories actually, but the first one is that obviously we didn't have the idea of a square wheeled bicycle. That was Stan Wagon, but we were the first ones to conceive of making it an exhibit that could be ridden again and again and again, by which I mean to put it in a circle. And when we had that idea, we knew it was a very good idea for a museum, so that you didn't have to get to the end of a track and have somebody lift up this heavy bicycle and move it back. But just about everybody around the room said, impossible. You'll never be able to build it. It will never work. Making it go around in a circle makes it just too hard. And I happened to be sitting next to George Hart at the time, which is a name that many of you probably know. And George kind of said quietly under his breath, it's just an engineering problem. And I knew when George said that we would be able to do it, because I knew that George knew what he was talking about. And sure enough, it was just an engineering problem, although it was quite an engineering problem in that it didn't work the first time or the second time or the third time. It took a lot of iterations before we got it to work. One of the changes we had to make was we thought if we painted a line on the road and told people to stay on the line, that would be fine. It turns out the engineering is so very precise that if you even steer off the line a little bit, it won't work. So now you can't steer. We had to lock the steering. Two more stories about the trike. The first one is that the trike first made its debut in June 2009 at the World Science Festival. And that was part of the Math Midway traveling exhibit, which we then traveled around the country for about 5 years before we sold it to the Science Center of Singapore. But when we finally raised enough money to open a physical museum, our initial plan was not to repeat anything from the Math Midway, because we had literally hundreds of ideas for math exhibits that we hadn't been able to use in that traveling exhibit. And so why repeat? We've already done the square wheel tricycle. And then a very wise trustee at a meeting said, wait a minute, let me understand this. You have an exhibit that has been written up in every language in newspapers around the entire world. People come from far and wide to see it every year. And you're opening a new museum in a city where sometimes museums are very unsuccessful. They open and close in less than a year. And you're not going to take this popular exhibit and put it front and center in this museum. Maybe you should think again. And we realized that was wise advice. And so we thought maybe we would make a different version. Maybe we would do something with pentagonal wheels or hexagonal wheels to be a little bit different. But then the operational side of my brain kicked in and said, we better make it exactly the same so that if something breaks on one or the other, we'll have spare parts that can be swapped back and forth. And in fact, that turned out to be a good thing. We have had occasions where we have borrowed our own trike from one exhibit, the traveling one, to put in the permanent museum and vice versa. And the last thing I'll tell you is it really is the case that the trike has been recognized around the world, because one day a young lady from Italy stormed into the museum. She looked to be a late teenager, high school age. And she said very angrily, where is that square wheeled tricycle? And we pointed her to it, but we wanted to know why the emotions were so high. And she said, this was a question on the national exam that I had to take for mathematics to graduate from high school. And it was so hard. And I guess they needed to derive the shape of the track that would work with a rolling square. So that was kind of a fun moment for us to know that the Museum of Math was actually mentioned on this national exam in Europe. So math makes the impossible possible for everyone. I wanted to have one picture to show young, old, black, white, male, female. Everyone should find a way to connect with mathematics. And that's a very important goal for us, is to make sure that people see those connections and feel like they belong. I know all of you know that math is a very welcoming place, but not everyone in the world realizes that. And so it's our goal to make sure that everyone does see math as a place where they belong. So I've showed you some pictures, but of course there's nothing like seeing a video. And some of you have heard of BuzzFeed, and there's a video I'll share with you in a moment. It's had more than 21 million views, probably even more than that. That was about 3 months ago when I last looked. But I'll just tell you a very funny story about BuzzFeed, which is they do research and they look at different places and they decide to go visit places and highlight them. And I guess they selected MoMath, and they got in touch with us and they asked if they could come in and film in the museum. And of course, my answer was yes, we were happy to have them. But then they gave me a contract that they wanted me to sign. And the contract was one I couldn't sign. It basically said that if they did something wrong and somebody was hurt, terribly hurt, it didn't matter. MoMath would bear all of the liability and BuzzFeed would bear none of it. And I didn't think that was a very wise thing to sign. And so I told them I couldn't sign it. We had to strike that. And they said they don't change their contract for anyone. And so we were sort of going back and forth. I was with the administrators of BuzzFeed. Meanwhile, we had set a date for them to come in and film. And so on that date, I was in the museum, and sure enough, these two young ladies showed up and said they were here to film for BuzzFeed. And I hadn't signed the contract, so I didn't really expect them, but I didn't say anything. And they went around and they did their filming. And as they were leaving, one of them opened up her purse and pulled out sort of a crumpled up piece of paper and said, oh yeah, I'm supposed to get you to sign this. And at that point they were leaving. And so I thought, okay, well, nothing happened, no liability worries there. So I was able to sign it because the filming was over. And I had no idea when I signed that what was going to happen, but those 21 million views made it so that our museum had so much attendance for the next 5 to 6 months. It was insane. We almost couldn't fit everyone that was coming. From the day this posted, it just went on for months. And so the power of social media is pretty intense. So I thought I would take a moment to share this little clip with you. So here at MoMath, visitors get to play with math. They get to see how math makes things that seem like they should be impossible actually possible. Okay, so that's the video that launched a huge attendance spurt in the museum. But now I want to move away from talking about the museum and some of the history of the museum to something we're all familiar with, squares and cubes. They seem to show up a lot in the museum, and so I thought it would be fun to share some stories that relate to squares and cubes and how they show up in the museum. So the first one I want to talk about is an exhibit we have called Twist and Roll. And you can see a picture on the screen, and I'll actually try and show it to you as well. So you can see there are two squares. If we just had one of them for a moment, you can imagine if I put this on a stick and I spun it around, we'd get the solid of revolution of a square, which I can show here. And it's two double cones, and that's not too surprising to anyone who's studied calculus or solids of revolution. And you can see in the picture just that. We also do this with other shapes, not just squares, and you can kind of see what the solids of revolution look like for each of those. But then what we do is if I take the square and I pull it apart, because I have two squares and they're symmetrical, I can actually give a 90-degree turn, put it back together, and now it's not a double cone anymore. It's kind of an unusual shape, and one could wonder what would happen if one would roll this shape. And that's exactly what the Twist and Roll exhibit is all about. And you can see on the left in the museum, there's a bunch of pathways, and you pull apart these solids of revolution, you twist them, you put them back together in a new form, and then you try and see which path they take. And all of those crazy looking paths are actually a path that is taken by one of those shapes that's been rotated, twisted, and put back together. On the right, you can see a portable version of that, which we took to a festival in Beijing. And that was actually my first and last visit to China in October of 2019. So just before the pandemic hit. And so Twist and Roll, anytime I'm showing a video, there's a URL in case you want to come back to the video. So this is twistandroll.momath.org. I think the other one was buzzfeed.momath.org. But here you can see what happens with the square when you take it apart, give it a twist, put it back together, and roll it. And kids and adults alike have a lot of fun trying to put these shapes together and figure out which path it will roll on. It seems kind of crazy that anything would roll on the way these paths look. So again, the idea of exploring, discovering, and finding some joy in mathematics. There's another fun square at MoMath. It's a really big square, and that's our Math Square exhibit. And you can see two different programs running on it in these images, but actually there are lots of different programs that run on it. The one on the left is something called a Voronoi diagram, and some of you may be familiar with that, but basically each person standing, you can see, has a different color around their feet, and a Voronoi diagram will color that region that is closest to that person than to anybody else on the floor. And of course, that's a static picture, but as those people move around, the regions also change. And so your color area might get bigger, it might get smaller as more people come on or off the floor. So that's an exhibit behavior that people really love. And in this particular case, this was a party going on. And so we like to say, we have the only Voronoi dance floor in all of Manhattan, maybe even in the whole country, I'm not sure. And on the right, we actually had a hackathon. We've had a few of them, but one year we had 4 high school students who got together and designed a new behavior for the Math Square exhibit. And this one is called Spirographs of Venus. And the way it works is when you first step on the floor, it's a black floor, there's nothing going on. There's just a yellow circle in the middle, kind of like the sun. And when you step on the floor, you create an orbit, a little planet that goes around the sun. And if a second person steps on the floor, then they get their own orbit. But what happens is, as your planet is circling the sun and their planet is circling the sun, lines go in between your planet and theirs. And remember, both are circling, but they are at a different radius from the center. So the lines start to do some interesting things. And this is a really fun app. You can try this one on your own at home too, venus.momath.org. But what I did was I created a little video so you can get a sense for how it works. And this is what you'll see if you go to that website on your own. So first you'll see one person steps on the floor, there's their planet. Now another one comes and you see the lines that are connecting the 2 planets as they go around. There's a third one and a fourth one will come up. And what happens is you start to see these lovely curves emerging, cardioids, all kinds of different ways that straight lines can make curves together. And of course, it's very lovely, very beautiful, and appeals to people's aesthetic sensibility, even while they might be interested in learning about the math. So you can try that one on your own as well. So here's a fun story about squares. I told you that I love wordplay and I love headlines that have great wordplay. And this is probably my all-time favorite newspaper headline. I did actually work for a newspaper for quite a few years. So I knew the people that came up with the headlines for that newspaper, and it's quite a job. I always was jealous of that person because I think it's really fun to think of clever wordplay. If you've ever seen the exhibits in MoMath, you'll see that there's a lot of wordplay embedded there. But in this case, this was a great headline. It was some squares, some squares. Of course, you have to get past the fact that those of us who like mathematics are being referred to as squares, but I'm proud to be a square. And we were adding up squares. And as you can see in the picture, there's the Flatiron Building. And if you're from New York, you may realize that New York is primarily in this part of town, an orthogonal grid with streets running one way and avenues running at right angles. And Broadway just kind of comes across and serves as a hypotenuse for lots of right triangles that it creates along the way. And the Flatiron Building happens to sit nestled in between 2 right-angled streets, 23rd Street and 5th Avenue, with Broadway forming the hypotenuse. And so yes, the Flatiron Building is not an isosceles triangle, as some souvenir shops might have you believe, but it's actually a right triangle. And we got the idea to see if we could get a lot of people to come out and have fun with math and actually measure the sides of it and prove that it was a right triangle. And it was so much fun that it actually made the Los Angeles Times, even though it was something going on in New York. And we literally had people, we used glow sticks as a unit of measurement. And I knew how many people we needed to make this work. I was a little bit worried that we wouldn't have enough people to get all the way around the Flatiron Building and then count off. But it turned out that we put out one email and we had more than 3,000 people sign up. So people got very excited about this large math demonstration right in the heart of Manhattan. And then I started to worry because we were thinking of this as a pretty casual event. Now we were shining projections. We did this at night. So we made 3 projections on all 3 sides of the building. And those were a visual proof of the Pythagorean theorem with the squares on each side. And we didn't have a permit for doing that. And we didn't have a permit for gathering thousands of people because we literally were hoping that we were going to get 50 people, 75 people. So now I started to get a little bit worried. And now we have 3,000 people coming. And what if we're not allowed to do this? What if we apply for a permit and we get rejected and we've already set this up? So I reached out to the local police precinct and left a message. And they called me back and left a message, and I called them back and left a message. And I suddenly realized that this was actually a good position to be in. And so we just continued to trade messages and never actually spoke to each other. And so I felt that I had a little bit of an excuse that, hey, I tried to get in touch with you. Sorry, it didn't work out. But they clearly knew we were coming, and there was a full police presence helping to make sure that the streets were not dangerous while we were doing this. And there's also a video of this I thought I would share. And again, pythagorizedvideo.momath.org is one that you can view on your own at home if you like afterwards as well.
What's going to happen here is we're going to actually measure the 3 sides of the Flatiron building using glow sticks as our unit of measurement. We're going to line the entire building with a giant glowing right triangle, the largest demonstration the Pythagorean theorem has ever seen.
As a nation, we're not graduating enough math majors. How do we get kids to do better in math? We get them excited about math.
So that was an incredible amount of fun. We call those math happenings, and we do them periodically in other places as well. So let's move away from squares now, and let's look at cubes for a moment. And I might ask everyone how you can divide a cube into 2 equal pieces. Now, of course, you're a different audience than most, so you may already know where I'm going with this, but mostly when I ask this question, people immediately think about 2 different ways that you could divide a cube. You can cut it from the top to the bottom and make 2 equal pieces, as we see here, or you can cut it from top to bottom a different way and make 2 triangular top pieces, or you can slice it through the middle and have 2 pieces, as we see here. But there's another way that you can slice a cube into 2 equal pieces that people don't think about necessarily when they are first asked this question. And if you make a slice that literally goes, if you look on the left, from one midpoint to another, so all around the 6 sides of the cube, going from midpoint to midpoint to midpoint, you end up with this hexagonal cross section. And that is an incredible surprise to most people, that you could take a knife and make one straight cut right through a cube and end up staring at a hexagon. And of course it makes sense because there are 6 sides on the cube and 6 sides on the hexagon, but still it's something that is surprising. We've actually done this with groups of students where we've used foam dice and had them draw from midpoint to midpoint with a pen and then take a scissor and you can cut right through. We've also done this with little cubes of cheese, which is fun. Then you get to eat the cheese. But we like this so much that we decided to embed this in the fabric of the museum. So another story about the museum is that our architects told us that we needed to have a vestibule because the way the wind blows and the direction of where the museum is located, if we didn't have a vestibule that people would come in that kind of had a door you come in and then another door you open to get into the museum, that when the door opened, the wind would blow right through our long, narrow space and it would be very awful and uncomfortable. And so we lost space that would have been exhibit space or front desk space or anything but just wasted space. But we decided to make lemonade out of lemons. And we thought if we have to have a vestibule, let's at least make it mathematical in some way. And so we made a perfect glass cube, and then we embedded in it this red hexagon. And many of you have been to MoMath, and you probably remember the pie-handled front doors, but I bet some of you did not notice that there is a red hexagon. And literally, we have the floor cut on the bottom with red embedded in the bottom of the floor, which our construction managers were shocked that we wanted to cut basically into 2 pieces this brand new floor that they were installing, but we insisted that this is in fact what we wanted to do. So you do get to walk right through a hexagon on your way into the museum. You know, there's one more way to break a cube into 2 equal pieces, and this one was maybe the most surprising one to me when I first saw it. And it's this, and this is a little cube. I don't know if it was originally conceived of by Carlos Acan or George Hart, because they both showed it to me independently. This particular one you're seeing is a puzzle that George Hart made for us. And I'll show you a little video. So we called it a scroob, and we did sell them for a while, but it turns out they're kind of hard to make. But I will show you how you can break this cube into 2 equal pieces just by twisting. And so the red piece and the blue piece are in fact identical. And by twisting them apart, that is yet another way you can break a cube into 2 equal pieces and then put them back together. By the way, this is not limited to 2. You can do this with 3 pieces or more pieces. But the 2-piece one is really satisfying because almost everyone can solve it. Even if you don't think you know how, if you kind of hold the pieces in your hands and you play with it a little bit, they just naturally want to fit together in this way and screw back together. So that's a surprise for people. And there's another really interesting mathematical surprise that comes out of cubes. And for this one, you have to first think about a cube as being divided almost the way we divide a Rubik's Cube. So if we were to break every face into 9 little smaller squares, and so in the end, you have a whole bunch of cubes making the bigger cube. And then you can imagine drilling a hole through the center of every face, straight through in all 3 directions. So there's a hole going from front to back, from top to bottom, and from side to side. And you could wonder what would happen if you cut that cube apart. But before you do that, you can even take it a step further. And you can now take, if you look back to this picture, you can imagine the 9 squares that were on each face. And now in each of those little squares, we've drilled a hole through the center in each of 3 directions. And then all of the smaller squares that you could imagine surrounding those. So this is a fractal. In its physical incarnation, we've only gone this far, but in the mathematical sense, you could keep doing this infinitely. And the question is, we saw that you could cut a cube into 2 equal pieces with a hexagonal cross section. What would happen if you have all these square holes that you've put through your cube and then you cut it into those 2 pieces with the hexagonal cross section? And I don't think there are very many people that can visualize this properly in their heads. Many of you may be familiar with this already. It's called a Menger sponge. But when someone sees this for the first time, I can count on one hand the number of people who guess right as to what happens when you take this apart. But what you actually see is a whole world of stars. And it's really incredible and surprising because all of the holes that you drilled through were cubes, were squares. And if you think about just drilling 1 square tunnel through a cube, you can envision an angular cut making a rhombus. And so what we're really seeing here is sort of the intersection of 3 rhombuses in 3 different directions, making a 6-pointed star. But still, there's nothing like seeing this for yourself to really bring out the wonder and the surprise and the beauty of mathematics. We don't have an exhibit on this in the museum right now. It's one of the exhibit ideas that we had that we ran out of money and space for, but we are hoping to expand the museum in the future and have a giant Menger sponge so that people can see how lovely and beautiful and surprising it is. So after all of this, I hope I've convinced you that a museum of math might add up after all. I think it does. In fact, it adds up so well that in June of 2019, we welcomed our 1 millionth visitor to the museum. And you can see that was a school group that happened to be the lucky group that had the 1 millionth visitor. They got a giant 1 million balloon. We also figured out that it would be a very nice walk around the Madison Square Park area if we made a 1,000,000 march for MoMath. Some of you in this room I know participated in that with us. And what we had were stops along the way at certain special numbers, and a mathematician or a museum staff person at each one of these stations who would talk to people about why that particular number was interesting and share the joy of math through the numbers and through the walk around the park. So that was a lot of fun for us. Also, I put together a little collage, and sometimes we use this as a quiz. And so maybe I'll ask just a few questions. So these are all people that are somewhat well-known who have visited the museum. So I'll tell you that there are 3 presidential candidates in these pictures, and only one of whom actually became president. So if you want, you can type in the chat who you see, who's a presidential candidate. Any guesses? Bill Clinton. Yep. Very good, Robert. Good to see you. Another presidential candidate, not too far off from Bill Clinton. Hillary. Yep. No fictional candidate. So there is one more candidate who from the last election, in fact, is kind of small, white shirt, blue tie, like a politician should be. And that's Pete Buttigieg, about 3 over from the left. So that's one famous person, 3 famous people who have been that ran for president. Let's see, there's a Nobel Prize laureate on this page. Maybe not that familiar to most of you. Yeah, no, Buttigieg is hard to spell. But it was fun having him in the museum when he was a candidate. That was exciting for us. So the Nobel Prize laureate is an economist. In the bottom right, that's Eric Maskin. Never heard Buttigieg said out loud before today. Okay, I had to learn how to pronounce it so I could introduce him. The richest man of 2020, probably still the richest man, has been to many places, including space, but also has been on the square wheel tricycle. That is Jeff Bezos, right under the MoMath logo, front and center. Will Shortz is all the way on the left in the light blue shirt, riding the tricycle. And his New York Times compatriot, Nate Silver, is down in the bottom left. You may recognize John Urschel, top right. He is a PhD candidate, or maybe even by now he's a PhD. If he's not Dr. John yet, he will be soon. But he also played for the Baltimore Ravens. Lots and lots of fun people here. There's the creator of the Rubik's Cube, actually, Erno Rubik is here. Jeremy Irons. Okay, I'll share one funny story. Jeremy Irons is on the right with the dog on the trike, and the dog's name is Smudge. And Nancy Blackman probably knows this story because Nancy arranged a screening of the movie about Ramanujan at the White House that some of us were fortunate enough to go to. And I happened to be online to enter the White House just a few feet in front of Jeremy Irons, who I knew already because he'd been to the museum with the dog Smudge. But the dog Smudge was also online to enter the White House. And this created quite a stir because the Secret Service was not prepared for whether or not they should allow a dog in. And so they said no, and he said yes, and he said he wasn't coming in without the dog. And ultimately, he did manage to come in, but it was quite a funny experience to be part of that. So lots of professional athletes. There's some Harlem Globetrotters, some New York Rangers. Next to Nate Silver and the bottom, just 1 over from him, that's the cast of Mean Girls. And that was a fabulous Broadway show. And I'll just mention, if you haven't seen it, it's also a movie. And the high point of the movie is when Katie Heron, the character played by the woman down at the bottom, she is the champion of the math team and wins the math competition for her whole team by knowing that the limit does not exist. And that's become sort of a favorite line. And it's fun to me that there's a movie and a Broadway show that were popular with people who don't know math. And here's this key moment where she says the limit does not exist. And it's great to see a young woman who is the hero of that story. So anyway, lots of interesting people here. And maybe if you come to the museum, we'll take pictures of all of you and you can join us as well. So we do like to spread our exhibits around the world. And so this is where we were in March of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. These are all the places where MoMath had a presence. And just 3 months later, in May 2020, we launched our online programs immediately when the museum shut down. And this is the number of countries we had a presence in with our programs by May of 2020. And that has just continued to grow. We are now in 113 countries around the world. So that has been one silver lining from the pandemic, that we've been fortunate to be able to provide engaging mathematics, entertainment, and programming and education to people around the world. So that has been something we've really enjoyed. We did reopen. We were the only museum in New York that was closed last summer, and that's because the state had a mandate that museums could open last summer of 2020, but any hands-on exhibits had to remain closed. And we were therefore mandated to stay closed, but we did finally reopen July 1st when all those restrictions were lifted, and we are back to being opened 7 days a week, 364 days a year. So if you haven't been to MoMath, I hope you'll come check us out. And if you have, I hope you'll come back. It's wonderful to be seeing people in person again. Again, we're at 11 East 26th between 5th and Madison. And then I'm happy to take any questions or just chat as people wish.
So thank you for this very beautiful presentation and for giving us an insight into the museum, even though we are far away, and showing us so many beautiful exhibits around the square.
I will share another story about, Paula says it's amazing how quickly we made MoMath available online. And I will tell you a little bit about why that happened. In January of 2020, my son came to visit me in New York with his girlfriend, and they showed up wearing masks. Well, she showed up wearing a mask. He did not. And I said, what's with the mask? And she said, I heard there's this virus in China, and I figure if it's in China, it's got to be in New York City. And she said, I brought a mask for your son too, but he refuses to wear it. And I brought one for you too, if you'd like it. And I said, no, I'm with my son. I'm perfectly fine. Thank you. And so we didn't wear masks, but she did, which is fine. But what she said didn't leave my head. And I continued to think about it. And so I went to a meeting early in February with our top managers. And I said, you know, there's this virus traveling around, and what would you guys do if we closed? How would you run your programs? How would we run the museum? What would we do? And they all didn't even know what I was talking about. What are you talking? We're not going to close. That's crazy. And I said, well, okay, call me crazy, but next week when we meet again, I'd like to know what everybody will do if we have to close. And so a week later, we got together and I asked everyone, what will you do if we have to close? And everyone, every single person had the same exact answer. And their answer was, you were serious? We thought that was a joke. So nobody had made any plans. And I said, well, yes, I am crazy. I admit I'm being crazy, but I am serious as well. So please go home next week and come back when we meet every week. Come back next week and tell me what you would do if we shut down. And so we actually had been talking about it since early February, and we did have a plan. And Zoom, which was something we hadn't used that often, we had decided that's what we would do. We had already looked into the costs and how many people we could fit in a Zoom room and how many rooms we could have and all of that. And so that's why we were able to hit the ground running. So on March 12th, we had the last in-person visitors to the museum, the last school group. And also on March 12th, the very same day, we had our first online field trip. We had a school that was supposed to come in person that got a little skittish because of the virus. And we said, well, we're prepared with online field trips, so you're welcome to switch. So we literally didn't even have a day where we had a break in the action.
As a follow-up question, speaking about, I mean, you shared a lot of the physical exhibits and in the very end stressed at how much the museum has done for the spread of and communication of mathematics worldwide through the outreach program, online outreach program. My follow-up question would be, I mean, MoMath does a lot, and there are many conferences that are now related to MoMath, like Moves and Matrix. And as you mentioned, there are also other activities running in the museum. Would you like to comment on these? I mean, for instance, Matrix for math communication and Moves for research in recreational mathematics.
Absolutely. So both of those conferences were originated by MoMath. So the Moves conference came about because early on, we had a presence at the joint math meeting, and we convened a number of people who were involved in many of the math societies. And we had a brainstorming session about what should we do? We want to be the National Museum of Mathematics. How do we best interact with all of you, with your communities, with the country? And there were two ideas that were floated. And at the end, the one that had the most interest was to have a recreational math conference. Apparently there had been a recreational math conference, an academic math conference for recreational mathematics years ago that had just stopped running. So there was an opportunity, there was an interest and a desire. And so we decided to run with that. And we started the Moves conference. Every other year we do that conference. And the thing that we decided to do that was maybe a little bit different than most academic math conferences was that, being as we are a museum that does have a goal of appealing to a general audience, we wanted mathematicians to come, but we wanted the families to come too. So we wanted it to be a conference where there would be things to do for your spouse, for your children, for your parents, for whomever you wanted to bring with you. And so we have a separate track for the families. We have the museum open for free to all the conference attendees. And then we have an academic math conference, which we encourage not just mathematicians, but math educators to join. And it has been just a wonderful community that has grown up around it. And Robert Vallon, who's on the call now, joined us a couple of years back, along with Josh Lazone, as one of the organizers of this conference. And my thanks go out to them and to the whole MoMath staff for allowing us to continue that conference. It was supposed to take place this past August in person. We did a little mini online event, and we are hoping to have the in-person conference Martin Luther King weekend, January this year. We'll see what happens with the variant, but that's our plan right now. So I hope many of you will join us. Matrix, on the other hand, I went to many ASTC, Aztec conferences. That's an Association for Science and Technology Centers, which we are one of. We were the only Museum of Math attending Aztec when we first started going. And it occurred to me that there were a lot of things that science centers like to talk about with each other. And there are things that are specific to math museums that don't get talked about at those conferences. And I thought it would be a great idea to try and have a conference for math museums. At the time, we were the only one in the US. So this meant by default, it would be an international conference. And given that we're the only museum in the US, it didn't really make sense to host it in the US because we would be the only one that wouldn't have to travel and everybody else would have to incur travel costs. So we hosted that in collaboration with one of the technical universities in Germany, the first one. And then the following year, it was hosted in, I guess, it was in Leeds in the UK. And the following year after that, it was in Barcelona with the folks from MACO, which is a very wonderful math museum outside Barcelona. If you ever get a chance, I encourage you to visit. And the next one is scheduled to take place in coordination with IHP, the Institut Henri Poincaré in Paris. And again, as we are doing with MOVES, this September 8th and 9th, so coming right up, we're going to have an online mini conference. It turned out that the original date of the Matrix conference was very close in time to another wonderful math conference, the Imaginary Conference. And so we decided back when we thought we were having the in-person conference before the pandemic, that we would partner with Imaginary because we know that travel budgets can be restricted and we didn't want people to have to choose between going to Imaginary and coming to Matrix. So now we have the Imaginary Matrix conference, September 8th and 9th, 2 days of online talks. They're going to be wonderful. I hope you'll join us. And following that, we will have in the spring, hopefully, the physical conference in Paris. I should also mention we have one of our keynote speakers going back to the MOVES conference. The theme this year will be the math of puzzles, and I believe Pete Winkler, who is one of our keynote speakers for that conference, is joining us. And I would be remiss if I also didn't mention that Pete was our second distinguished visiting professor. And when the pandemic hit, his time with us was cut short, and he had the absolutely brilliant idea to start a puzzle distribution called Mind Benders for the Quarantine. Those 113 countries that know about MoMath, in large part, are thanks to the work of Peter Winkler. He's amazing. So thank you, Peter.
And we have a question from the audience. Is MoMath open to sharing their model with others who wish to open similar museums in other places, both in US and abroad?
And the answer is, I told you I fell into this as a volunteer initially. And the thing that shocked me the most about being in the museum world was how collaborative it is. I came from a very competitive industry where one company was sort of battling other companies and sometimes in not nice ways. And when I got into the museum world, it was so lovely to see how people collaborate. And especially in the world of math museums, there are not very many of us. And so the Mathematicum, for example, in Gießen, Germany, the founder of that museum opened up his museum and his records and his stories to us. And we, in large part, modeled ourselves after that wonderful museum. And that's Albrecht Beutelspacher. And he does that for many math museums. And it's just a very collaborative industry. So I meet with people all the time from many different countries, from Seattle in the US, where there's a plan to open another math museum. And we are very happy to share our wisdom and our experience and the things we did that weren't so wise as well with others, to help them open math museums in their own communities. So there is math museum underway in the UK, in Beijing, in Poland, obviously in Paris. That one will open soon. So it's a very growing world and a growing community. And yes, if anyone on this call is interested in opening a math museum or helping open one that's already underway in your country, absolutely reach out.
Oh, I come from San Francisco, and back in the 60s or 70s, they opened up the Exploratorium in the Palace of the Fine Arts. I had never seen a museum like that before. Do you consider it a spiritual ancestor of MoMath? And comment on that, if you will.
That is such a fabulous question, and more appropriate than you realize, because there's somebody who over in Israel created I'll call it the first sort of hands-on science center, and the Exploratorium is modeled after that. And when we started, Glenn would walk around and say, what we want to do is build the Exploratorium of mathematics. So yes, we do view that as a grandfather for us as well. But also the gentleman who is kind of the father of the Exploratorium in that sense, we are hoping to bring him to MoMath, and we're hoping to do an art exhibit with some of his harmonograph pictures. So a very appropriate question. I'm in conversation with him right now. He's in his 90s at this point. And so we're hoping to do this sooner rather than later. So if you're not on the MoMath mailing list, you should join so you don't miss what might be a really interesting opportunity to meet him and to see some of his work.
And everyone who has not been to the Exploratorium, if you're ever in San Francisco, be sure you go.
Yes, and the Exploratorium is a fabulous place. And they actually have at least one exhibit that was modeled after MoMath, an exhibit at MoMath, which is fun because they usually don't do anything that's not made themselves. So we actually have met with their design team, and I've met with the chairman of their board, and it's a fabulous, fabulous museum. Can't say enough good things about it. And if anybody compares us even a little bit to the Exploratorium, I'm delighted by that, just to be in that company. And yes, Ivan Moscovich is the name, and we're hoping that Ivan will be coming to New York soon.
I would like to thank everyone in the attendance, and I would like to thank Cindy especially for this very beautiful insight, and for, well, as you say, this sharing that exists in the math communication community and math museum community, which I think you brought to light and illustrated very well. And yeah, and if you wanted to share some last thought, I remember that there is a place where people can submit ideas to exhibits, and someone earlier on suggested that there should be a wall of math jokes. So I'm sure that the MoMath is also very open to ideas, right?
Absolutely. If you have ideas, let us know. A wall of math jokes are hard because they have to be funny, and they hopefully have to be funny to people. There are mathematician math jokes, right? That all the mathematicians will be laughing at and everybody else won't. And then there are math jokes that are more general audience. So I feel like we would need two walls, actually. We would want to appeal to both groups. I'll leave you with one last story because it's a fun one. So I've just typed in the chat, that's the MoMath main phone number. And the story I'll share, it came to mind when you mentioned the Exploratorium, and I'll tell you how the Exploratorium ties into our phone number. So when we first started the museum, we were going to open on Long Island near Stony Brook University, where there's a wonderful math department and a lot of people were interested. That's where George Hart was a professor. That's where Glenn Whitney lived. So Stony Brook it was going to be, and the idea just took off, and suddenly we were going to be a New York City museum, not a little suburban outpost. And so we had to get an office in New York, and we had to get a phone number. And it turns out that 212, which is sort of the New York area code, those phone numbers aren't really out anymore. If you go into New York now, you get all kinds of different numbers, but they're not 212 numbers. But we wanted 212 because we wanted to feel like we were a venerable old New York institution, even though we were just starting out. And it turns out you can buy 212 numbers. There's a market for these things online. And so we went online, and right away, we saw that there was a 212 number that could be made into a little math puzzle. And we thought, well, we should do that. And then we looked at the price, and it was like $100. And we were just starting out, and it just seemed like ridiculous that you should have to pay money for a phone number. Aren't phone numbers free? And so we sort of hemmed and hawed and debated back and forth about it. And after about a week, we decided, well, it's probably worth paying the $100 to have a phone number that's a puzzle. And we went back online only to find out that that number was long gone. And this market moves quickly for these 212 numbers. And so we started looking for anything, you know, could we get something that had the digits of pi or something that would have relevance? And every day the mathematicians were looking and nothing. Finally, there was a number that we could make a math puzzle out of, but now it was like, I don't know, $500. So we were feeling really stupid because we could have had a number for $100 right away. And because we waited around, now we had to spend so much more money, but we paid it and we got the number that I've put in the chat. And then we were lucky enough to get a meeting in the Google offices with some of the key movers and shakers at Google to tell them about this idea we had to open a math museum. And we had a lovely meeting. And as we were leaving, one of them said, how will we get in touch with you? And so Glenn quickly went and wrote on the whiteboard the phone number. He said, well, you can call this number. And by the way, it's a math puzzle. And the math puzzle is, as he's written the number and as I've written it in the chat, you can add exactly 2 symbols and make this a valid equation. Exactly 2, not 3, not 1, 2. And immediately all the heads at the Google table went down and the pencils were flying. And somebody said, I got it, but no, he had added 3 symbols. So we said, nope, that's not right. The heads go back down. And finally, one of them gets it and they're all excited. And as we're walking out, I hear one of them say, those guys are as crazy as we are. And I knew when they said that that was a good thing. That was meant in a positive light. And a couple of weeks later, they announced a museum initiative that they were giving money to, I think it was 10 or 12 museums around the world. The Exploratorium being one of them, the New York Hall of Science, the London Museum of Science, like all these top museums. And then the first museum in the list, the #1 in their press release, was the National Museum of Mathematics, which was just the Museum of Mathematics at that point, but we didn't even exist yet. And so that little puzzle, we ended up with $2 million from Google. I think it's because of that puzzle. So that $500 we paid for that phone number turned out to be well worth it. And I'm going to leave you with the puzzle to think about, and I'm happy to share the answer if you can't figure it out. But I think most of you here will get it. So thank you. It's been a pleasure.